At some point in our lives, just about every horror fan out there is going to come up against the question, why do you love horror movies? More often than not, that question comes loaded with assumptions. Sometimes they really want to know, but oftentimes they want to know how any sane person could enjoy horror movies, and it can make horror fans a little bit defensive. We here at RUE Morgue love to debunk assumptions, and as sick as I am of defending my love of horror, I love to provide fellow horror fans with the kind of vernacular that'll really shut those naysayers down. So today we're going to talk about what horror is, what horror isn't, and how we can defend our love of it. Welcome to the RUE Morgue Blood Bible. So what is horror? Most horror fans will answer that horror is a film genre, not unlike the detective genre in film, mystery, noir. These are genres in film, but that doesn't quite get at what horror is exactly, because horror is actually much more than film. Others might say that horror is anything that gives the sensation of fear or making you scared, but that doesn't quite get at it either. Horror is much more than just being scared. There are lots of things you could do that might frighten you that have nothing to do with horror. Public speaking, for example, bungee jumping. These are things that'll give you those visceral thrills, but they're not horror. Now, before we go any further, I think it's important that we all take a cerebral step back from what we think we understand horror to be. And I think that's true of whether you're a die-hard horror fan, a regular RUE Morgue reader, or just somebody who stumbled across this video. It's a tricky subject, and so I think we all need to pretend that we're just an alien visiting Earth and we have no idea what horror is, and to take a step back and take a really objective stance like a detective might. Because RUE Morgue is actually named after a detective story by Edgar Allan Poe. So let's all take a page out of his book and see where that takes us.
Heresy!
Heresy? Heresy? Do they still burn men for heresy? Then burn me, monsieur. Light the fire.
So let's start at the very beginning and look at the word itself, horror. This unusual word comes from the Latin verb horrere, which literally means to tremble. So right away we have our first clue. Horror refers to a physiological reaction, and a physiological reaction is something we can't necessarily control. The reaction that the original term is describing has nothing to do with the cognitive processes of interest and fun and thrills. It's referring solely to a mixture of intense repugnance and fear, a reaction so terrifying that it can make you literally shake in your skin. So this term is referring to a physiological experience of repugnance and fear, something so terrifying that it makes you tremble in your own skin. It's not really taking into account the more cognitive processes of the fun and the thrills, which we'll get into later, but still, this is the origin of the term, and it's a good starting point. So here is where the modern understanding of fear diverges from the Latin origin. Horror fans aren't looking to simply experience the physiological reaction of fear and repugnance. That's part of it, but in truth, there's way easier ways to experience a thrill or a chill that literally makes you tremble. You can stick your finger in an electrical socket or go for a polar dip or something. What horror fans are after is something more. Horror fans are seeking entertainment. Entertainment that tackles the subject of fear and repugnance. And that entertainment is an art form. As an art form, horror has its origin in the Greek tragedies circa 5th century BC, which depicted protagonists on the stage dying in horrible ways. Over the centuries, as drama evolved, it gradually placed more and more emphasis on the morbid aspects of the plot, to the point where they became the central feature of the show and contributed to the creation of the horror genre. The people who are credited for actually creating the genre, writers like Edgar Allan Poe, Bram Stoker, and Mary Shelley, all wrote within the early 18th to 19th centuries. What made their writings different is that they sought to recreate that feeling in the reader through a narrative, rather than simply describing a situation of terror. This idea took hold, and that focus on recreating terror in an audience became the main purpose of the horror genre from then on. So with this historical context in mind, we arrive at the first stage of a working definition. Horror is an art form that aims to recreate an extreme feeling of repugnance and fear. So that's a workable definition that takes the historical context of horror and the physiological reaction of horror into account. But once again, to take the example of aliens who don't know anything about horror, if you were to give that definition to them, they wouldn't really have a sense of what horror is, what it feels like, what this culture of fandom is like. So to that end, we can distill two major characteristics of the horror genre, things that appear in all horror, one or the other, sometimes both in some capacity. And one of those things is violence. And violence, it's a huge spectrum. It could be anything from splatter and gore films that have very overt visual violence to thrillers and psychological thrillers where it's more about psychological violence or even just the threat of violence. The other core element is the supernatural. And when I say the supernatural, I don't necessarily mean ghosts. I don't know about you, but when I hear the word supernatural, I think of ghost hunters right away. But what I mean when I say supernatural is anything that transcends the laws of nature, anything unnatural, supernatural in that way. So it could be anything pertaining to ghosts and the afterlife. Like I said, it could be anything fantastical. Hell, like I'm giving an example of aliens. This is supernatural. So these are things that are often found in modern horror. Not always, and of course there are exceptions, and I know you're gonna let me know in the comments below. But these are the core elements that give us a more working definition of the genre that has a little bit more flavor. So with that in mind, let's revise our definition as follows. Horror is any art that aims to recreate an extreme feeling of repugnance and fear by usually, but not always, using elements of violence and/or the supernatural. So how does horror as an art form accomplish this recreation of physiological responses, and what might that look like? Well, that's going to be the hardest part to explain to an alien, because really that's the most exciting part about being a horror fan. There are so many ways to do it, and content creators are finding new ways to freak us out all the time. That's part of what makes the genre so rich. It's definitely part of what I love about the genre. As to why us weirdos actually like that fucked up shit, well, that's going to be a different episode of RUE MORGUE TV. But for now, I'm ANDREA SUBISSATI, and thank you for tuning into the Blood Bible. We'll see you next week. Is that right?